I am Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. Welcome to this episode of The Underground, a program that explores the testimony of the biblical prophets, the gospel of Jesus Christ, current events, and how all of these things relate to you and me. Now, on this episode, I actually want to pick up with the last episode. Last time I was with you, we discussed the issue of the Antichrist and this notion, this idea that the Antichrist will be Jewish. And the purpose of that session was to lay out a broad biblical framework to understand the Antichrist. You could even say a biblical theology of the Antichrist. What are the foundational texts within the scriptures that introduce this idea? Where does this idea even come from in the Bible? And so that was the primary purpose of last week's session. However, I didn't even really end up getting to the majority of the most relevant biblical texts. I spent a lot of time discussing why this information is relevant, why it's important. You have this idea, this scenario growing within segments of the biblical prophecy world that essentially says the Antichrist, not simply that he will have some Jewish lineage, some Jewish DNA, but that rather the coming great deception at the end of the age will be a false Jewish Messiah that will primarily be followed by the Orthodox Jews, and many Christians throughout the earth will follow him, get behind him, because he will essentially be a superhero Zionist. He will defeat the surrounding Muslim nations. He will show the strong arm of Israel and this type of thing, and therefore Jews and many Zionist Christians, this kind of idea will get behind him. Okay, so this is an idea that is growing and spreading in the body of Christ, and as I said, it is a system of belief which is inherently anti-Semitic. I want to be clear, not everyone that holds to the idea that the Antichrist could have some Jewish DNA in him or this type of thing are necessarily viscerally hateful of the Jewish people. However, you do have people that are promoting this, Christians that are promoting a systemic structural form of anti-Semitism. And it's essential that we recognize that. In the same way, as I said last time, in the same way that replacement theology or supersessionism is a system which inherently supports anti-Semitism, we need to root it out of the church. Again, folks like the late, great R.C. Sproul, He embraced supersessionism, replacement theology. He was a partial preterist. A great teacher, a great man of God. I don't think anyone will deny that. And I don't think anyone would say that he had a visceral hatred of the Jewish people, but he did support a system of theology which oftentimes does logically lead to a mistreatment of the Jewish people. And that is demonstrably, you can go through Christian history, that is demonstrably provable. Okay? This idea that God has permanently rejected the Jewish people, that he has transferred his purposes to the church, and that he was formerly working with the nation of Israel, and now he's working universally with all people. That idea, as innocuous as it sounds, as harmless as it may sound, if you follow it through to its very logical conclusions, which is exactly what thoughtful Christian theologians have done down through history, it leads you to ask this question. Say, okay, God, you have chosen to permanently disband this people, to exile them from the nation, to break them up as a family, as a people, to disperse them among the nations as punishment for their unbelief, for their rejection of Jesus. Then the next question is, how should we as Christians, as your servants, God, how should we be treating those that you are punishing, that you have chosen to permanently disperse? Or if there's this effort to revive, to reestablish the state of Israel, should we support it? Or have you permanently disbanded them? Right? So this led Christian theologians to coin the term, the Jewish question. And this became debated throughout medieval European Christian history. It was called the Jewish question. How should we treat them? Should we treat them with kindness? Perhaps they'll repent and turn to the gospel, turn to the Messiah. Or should we treat them with harshness? And so this question ultimately, after, again, centuries of debate among theologians, it led to, and again, demonstrably, episodes, punctuated, painful episodes of the mistreatment of the Jewish people. It led to Martin Luther in his book, The Jews and Their Lies, ultimately saying, guys, I'm going to answer the Jewish question once and for all. This is what we should do. Drive them like screaming dogs out of the city. Burn their synagogues to the ground. This type of thing, right? Horrible, horrible stuff. So then Adolf Hitler comes along, and again, Adolf Hitler was not a Christian. However, what did Adolf Hitler say? He said, I am going to bring the final solution. The final solution to what? To the Jewish question. Hitler was not a Christian, but his solution, the Holocaust, his effort to wipe out the Jewish people, was his effort to end once and for all this question that had been brewing among Christian theologians for centuries, okay? So no one can tell me that replacement theology, whether you want to call it inclusion theology, fulfillment theology, no matter how much of a nice spin you want to put on it, no one can tell me that it is not structurally and systemically hateful toward the Jewish people. History has proven it, and it ultimately did lead to, it led to pagans such as Adolf Hitler using Christian theology to support satanic acts. Okay, so likewise, the idea that the coming Antichrist, biblically speaking, is a false Jewish Messiah that will primarily be a Jewish nationalist, this type of thing, that is a fundamentally evil, clearly unbiblical, satanic doctrine that is spreading in the body of Christ right now. Again, so in case I didn't make that very clear last time, I think I've restated it pretty clearly. Now, let's look at the biblical basis, guys, because, again, I threw this out, and I interacted a bit with some of the comments. I had people say things like, well, Judas is an antichrist. I go, where does the Bible ever say that? The Bible does not portray Judas as an antichrist. People say, well, he's called the son of destruction, and the antichrist is called the son of destruction. Guys, this is within the interpretation of the Bible. This is a fallacy, okay? It's a common fallacy, and it's the type of fallacy that those who are not trained, who do not understand the proper, again, principles of biblical interpretation might make. Because one person has a particular characteristic or is called a particular thing does not mean that another person who has that same characteristic or is called that same thing are one and the same. Guys, Satan is called the morning star, essentially the son of the morning. Isaiah 14, Jesus is called the bright morning star. They are not one and the same. You could look at dozens of other similarities throughout the scriptures. Judas is not a picture of the Antichrist. That's been claimed by different people, but biblically speaking, when you look at the apostles, when you look at John, when you look at Paul, the passages that they cite, the passages that are universally agreed upon by theologians to be referring to the Antichrist, are consistently over and over again Gentile, foreign, pagan, invaders, enemies of the people and the state of Israel at the end of the age, just before the return of Jesus. This is so essential, guys. Listen, we want to be people who handle the Word of God responsibly. We want to be people who emphasize that which the Scriptures emphasize. We don't want to be like, well, if you look at this obscure passage in Judges, you've got this something, and so has suggested that this might be a type of the Antichrist. Or if we don't primarily build our theology based on esoteric, sort of, unusual texts and this sort of thing. We want to have clear foundation for our doctrines. Okay, so let's do that again, and we're going to speed through the passages that we already looked at. But we want to take some time to look at many of the passages that we didn't, because I want to drive this point home. Biblically speaking, the Antichrist is consistently, from the beginning to the end, portrayed as a Gentile, pagan, foreign, dictator, leader, invader of the land of Israel, an enemy of the people of Israel. That is the primary foundational biblical way that he is portrayed, not as a false Christ, not as a false Messiah, rather someone who is opposed to the redemptive purposes of Messiah, which is ultimately the salvation, yea, of the Gentiles, but yea, of Israel. First and foremost, it is the salvation of his people, Israel. That's exactly what Paul said, right? The gospel is proton to the Jew. It's first to the Jew. It's especially to the Jew. Yeah, it's for all of us Gentiles, but first and foremost, it's to the Jew. Any theology that doesn't understand that the gospel is most naturally first and foremost to the Jewish people has a bad understanding of the gospel, right? Okay, so we began by looking at Genesis 3:15, the proto-evangelion, the first gospel, the first instance of the gospel in the Bible. And this is the passage where the Messiah is introduced to us. He is the crushing one. He is the one that's going to crush the head of Satan. And it's introduced as this story that unfolds throughout the Bible, a story of enmity, a story of conflict between the children of Satan, the seed line of Satan, and the children of Eve, the righteous side. And again, we know that that seed line produced people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And even from the children of Jacob came Judah, Genesis 49, the prophecy concerning the king of Israel that would come from Judah, the lion of the tribe of Judah, right? So that's the foundational text. We begin with this imagery of conflict between two peoples. We move forward. We looked at Numbers 24. Numbers 24, the prophecy of Balaam. Balaam prophesies. He's looking at the tents of Israel, and he says that the seed of Israel would be well watered. It would provide relief and respite to the people, ultimately from the fall, which is exactly what is inferred back in Genesis 3:15. And then it talks about this king of Israel. And what does the king of Israel do? He destroys, he crushes the enemies of Israel. The Messiah, the king of Israel, the seed, right? His primary description from the beginning, back in the books of Moses, as the revelation concerning who the Messiah is he is the one that would crush the enemies of Israel. Now again, we start at the beginning, but we also already know the end of the story. How does the story end? It ends with Jesus crushing the enemies of Israel, led by the Antichrist, right? The Antichrist is the leader of this coalition of nations, this army of nations, this empire, however you want to describe it, this alliance. He is the leader. He is the satanically led leader of this alliance that invades Israel. Look, guys, just step back and think about this for a minute. Anyone who understands Bible prophecy at all understands that the Antichrist leads a coalition of nations that invades the land of Israel. Here's a little ironic point that I'll make. You get guys like Amir Sephardi, and they'll go, this whole Muslim Antichrist, like he uses really kind of, I will just say harsh language, don't give me any of this nonsense of Muslim Antichrist. And I've heard people have said this to me for so long. They go, the Jews would never accept a Muslim Messiah. And as I pointed out in the last episode, the Bible never says the Jews will accept the Antichrist. Quite to the contrary, the biblical narrative is of a foreign pagan invader. Now, again, we could look at so many passages in Zechariah 12 through 14, in Joel, in Isaiah, in Micah, in Ezekiel. He is the foreign invader. In Daniel, right? Everyone knows he is a foreign invader, coalition of nations. He's not an internal Messiah. He's not a nationalist, Jewish false Christ. Okay? The Bible does not portray the Antichrist as a false Jewish Christ, a false Jewish Messiah. Right? So people say, the Jews would never receive a Muslim Messiah. And I go, guys, do you think the Muslims would receive a Jewish Messiah? Because demonstrably, when you look at every single passage, and I've said this a million times, every single passage throughout the Scriptures that names names, that points to geography, regions, nations, peoples, tribes that will be part of the Antichrist coalition, every single last one in the Bible, every single time the Bible names names or points to geography, it's always Middle Eastern, North African nations, Muslim majority nations. So the idea that a Jew is going to lead a coalition of Iran, Sudan, Turkey, etc., that's somehow acceptable, and yet the idea that all these Muslim nations would fall a Muslim nationalist dictator, that's hard to believe. It's strange, the cliches that people throw out there. And again, this is I'm not trying to attack Amir Tsarfati. It's just making the point that he makes this point very forcefully. The Jews would never accept a Muslim Messiah. And I go, it doesn't matter. The Bible never says they will. This is a cliche. It's a cliche, and it's unbiblical. Okay, so we talked about Balaam, the prophecy of Balaam. The Messiah, the King of Israel, is the one who will crush the enemies of Israel. Let's look at, we did mention Micah 5. We did mention Micah 5. Again, the Bethlehem-born Messiah. Undeniably, across the boards, every commentary is going to affirm the fact that Micah 5 is talking about the Messiah. What does the Messiah do? He will deliver us, who? Israel, from the Assyrian. When the Assyrian invades our land and marches across our borders, he is a foreign invader. He's called the Assyrian. Now, does that mean that he must be a bloodline ethnic Assyrian? No, I think that is an overly rigid method of interpretation. Does it mean just general bad guy, just Israel's enemies? I think that's an overly loose interpretation. I think somewhere in the middle we could say that because the Antichrist is called the Assyrian, whereas Micah used the events of his day, of his near future, and he prophesies through those events, pointing to the ultimate omega point of prophetic hope and expectation, which is the coming of the Messiah. So Micah calls the coming last days Antichrist the Assyrian, right? Because it's the Messiah that will deliver Israel from the invader, from the outside invader invading the land. I think it's probably reasonable to say that the Antichrist will at least come from within the boundaries of the ancient Assyrian Empire. But there's really no way to make a European Antichrist the Assyrian. Like that just basically may as well just rip Micah 5 out of the Bible. And again, I've mentioned this different times over the years. I talked to Tim LaHaye a couple years before he died, and he actually elaborated. He said the reason that he chose Nicolae Carpathia is his Antichrist figure, this Romanian, is because he was convinced that the Antichrist must be an ethnic DNA bloodline descendant of the Romans. Okay, and then I didn't go there, but my temptation is to say, but how is he the Assyrian, right? You can't make the Romans the Assyrian, right? I would argue that his interpretation of the one text, Daniel 9:26-27, that led him to believe the Antichrist must be Roman, it was a misinterpretation of those two verses. The overwhelming consensus of passages speak of the Antichrist as coming from the Middle East. Overwhelming, consistently, over and over and over again. They're always pointing to the same region, to the Middle East, to the land of Turkey and Syria, to the north of Israel, not Europe. In any case, we talked about Micah 5. Let's look at Habakkuk 3. Habakkuk 3 is, it's one of my new favorite chapters. It's one of the most detailed, beautiful verses in the whole Bible that talks, not verses, passages, chapters, prophecies, that talks about the return of Jesus. It is just a glorious, glorious passage. But it gives great detail about this Lord, the Lord marching majestically, plagues and pestilences go before him. This is the picture of Isaiah 63, the Lord's marching up through Edom. But in verses 12 through 14, again, Habakkuk 3, 12 through 14, it says this, in wrath you strode through the earth, or the NASB says, in wrath you marched through the earth. It's much more accurate. You strode, you marched through the earth. In anger, you threshed the Gentiles, the nations, right? It says you came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. And the term there is actually referring to the people of Israel. So according to the scriptures, again, according to the scriptural narrative, the Messiah is the one that when Jesus returns, the Messiah, he will deliver Israel. He will judge the Gentiles. Again, this story is told over and over and over again throughout the Old Testament, the Bible of Jesus, the Bible of the apostles, before the New Testament was ever written, told a story of a coming evil one at the end of the age that will be destroyed by the Messiah. This Antichrist is the ultimate seed that will come from the seed line of Satan. The Messiah is the ultimate seed that will come from the seed line of the woman. Back to the prophecy of Genesis 3:15, the declaration of Genesis 3:15. The Messiah will crush the puppet of Satan, and he's a Gentile, always a Gentile that comes against Israel, the righteous seed line, and the Messiah delivers them. So, and then it goes on. It says, you went forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed people, the NASB says. And then it says this, you struck the head of the house of evil to lay him open from thigh to neck. So again, this is future. This is future. When Jesus comes back, he will strike, he will crush. Again, Genesis 3:15 always goes back to the crushing one. He will crush the head of the house of the wicked or evil. That's the Antichrist. In fact, this is one of the clearest, earliest biblical references to the Antichrist. He is called the head of the house of the wicked, or the head of the house of evil. And when the Messiah comes back, it says he will lay him open from thigh to neck. Some translations say from tail to neck. Again, that would sort of infer the dragon, the serpent more so. The Antichrist is the human puppet, if you will, of the dragon. He's the finger puppet. Woo! I'm the Antichrist! Except I guess with that analogy, I would be the puppet master. Satan is the puppet master. The Antichrist is the puppet. Okay? Then we can look at a lot of passages, again, in Isaiah and throughout the minor prophets. There's a lot that we could look at. But I wanted to make sure that we got to Daniel. I just sort of referenced Daniel in the last session. Daniel 2 is the foundational chapter in the book of Daniel that introduces a very important series of concepts. But ultimately you have this metallic statue. We all know the story. Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler of ancient Mesopotamia, he has a dream, and he's disturbed by the dream. So he calls all of his wise men and so forth, his court wise men. Guys, I want you not only to give me the interpretation of the dream, because you can fudge that. I want you to tell me the dream. If you tell me my dream, then I know that it's from, God or whatever, God, the gods. And then if you give me the interpretation, I'll trust if you can tell me the dream. And they're like, we can't do that. There is this guy, Daniel, from among the Jewish exiles, the Israelite exiles. Let's get him. Maybe he'll save our hides, type of thing. So Daniel comes, and he tells Nebuchadnezzar, he says, listen, know this, O king, there is a God in heaven who reveals these things to men. Give me a night to sleep on it. I'll come back to you. So Daniel does, and of course the Lord reveals Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and the dream is of a metallic statue. It's a metallic statue. We all know about the metallic statue. If you've been studying biblical prophecy at all for any number of years, everyone knows the statue. Head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly, and it's important that from the belly down to just above the knees of bronze. Some of the old King James translations is copper. Bronze, belly and thighs of bronze. And then legs of iron, feet of iron and clay. Now, we're not going to discuss now the identity of all of these, but we all agree that it's Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece. Okay? There's some debate within the body of Christ whether or not the legs of iron represent Rome or the historical Muslim empires. Of course, I hold to the idea that it's the Islamic empire, the historical Islamic caliphate, right? That's not the point of this particular discussion. However, the point is this. They are 4, or arguably 5, because the legs also have the feet of iron and clay, which is a last days manifestation of the legs of iron of that kingdom, a revival of that kingdom. So you have yea 4, yea 5. What are they? Gentile, pagan kingdoms. These are the primary vessels through which Satan will accomplish his efforts at resistance. Efforts at the resistance of what? Resisting the culmination and the fulfillment of God's promised plan of redemption, of restoration. Restoration of what? of the Garden of Eden, of the kingdom of David. Mix them together, pour some glory all over it. You're beginning to get a picture of the coming kingdom. The Messiah is coming back to restore, to undo the curse of the fall, to restore the Garden of Eden, to restore the throne of his father David. Again, something far more glorious than any of those things. He's coming back to do those things, right? And Satan has an effort throughout history. It unfolds throughout history. He is about the business of trying to thwart that promised plan of God. What is the primary way that he does that? Through pagan, Gentile empires, right? It's been Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece. Those are the primary historical types of the Antichrist. When Sennacherib came in and carried away the northern 10 tribes of Israel, he becomes, according to Micah, the Assyrian. He becomes a foreshadow, a prototype of the Antichrist. That's why Micah calls him the Assyrian, the one that Jesus is going to deliver Israel from when the Assyrian marches into Israel's borders. Sennacherib, the historical invading leaders of the Assyrian Empire, right? Nebuchadnezzar becomes a type of the Antichrist. It calls him the Chaldean. You have references to Nebuchadnezzar being a type, a foreshadow of the Antichrist. And by the way, I'll throw this out because I've seen some people even made comments. They go, the Antichrist is going to be a Jewish Assyrian, a mixed, And this is an example of someone looking at one particular verse, and he's called the Assyrian. Therefore, they go overly rigid, overly wooden, literal, and they go, the Antichrist must be a bloodline Assyrian. And I go, the Bible also calls him the Chaldean. So you end up with all kinds of goofiness. We have to not take these passages in an overly rigidly wooden way and understand the pattern of biblical prophecy. Again, the prophets use events of their day or their near future, so they were relevant to their immediate hearers, but they're always prophesying through those events as they're pointing to the ultimate final eschatological end time conflict and victory of the Messiah. That's what they're always pointing to. And so again, we don't want to be overly wooden, rigid. We don't want to just say, oh, it doesn't mean anything. Oh, Assyrian, it just means bad guys. It doesn't mean anything. It means, sin. It means materialism. Like you hear people just make the most vague statements. And I go, no, guys, you've gone way too far on the other side of the spectrum. Somewhere in the middle is a responsible hermeneutic, a responsible method of interpreting these things. The Bible repeatedly, consistently uses types and shadows of the Antichrist, the Assyrian, the Chaldean, right? He's always coming from that particular region. The biblical prophets name names. They point to regions. They name nations. They name tribes. They're always Middle Eastern, North African. You can't get around it. That's not to say that many other nations will not be part of the coming Antichrist coalition. But again, people, we want to emphasize what the Bible emphasizes. We want to focus on that which the Bible is focused on. And where the Bible is silent, we need to be awfully careful. Awfully, awfully careful. But in all of these passages that are literal, that are easy to understand, that are clear, they're not symbolic, they're not difficult texts. The prophets name names. Jesus is coming back to destroy a coalition of Middle Eastern nations. So after Daniel 2, we have Daniel 7. Daniel 7 is now the vision of the 4 gruesome beasts. And there's various interpretations of Daniel 7. I am of the opinion that Daniel 7 is a recapitulation. It is a reiteration of that which has already been told by Daniel chapter 2. And these beasts represent what? Pagan, invading, Gentile empires or nations and kingdoms. But that's what they were. They were essentially empires. So you have, you've got the lion with the wings and it stands up, that's Babylon. You've got the bear leaning on one side, Medo-Persia. You've got the leopard, 4 heads, 4 wings. We agree that that is the historical Greek, Alexandrian Greek Empire. And then you have the final beast. You have the final one, which is a combination of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, right? We see that later in Revelation 13. That is the beast empire, the final revival of this 4th kingdom. And it is, again, a combination of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece. That's not European. It's not European. Okay, so now let's actually read some from Daniel chapter 7. I think it's important because there are key terms in here. Again, we want to focus on that which the Bible is focused on. We want to understand how the apostles, how the New Testament understands the concept of the Antichrist. Daniel 7, beginning in verse 7. After this I kept looking in the night visions. This is the NASB. And behold, a fourth beast. The fourth beast is the final beast, the Antichrist kingdom. But again, it has two components or two segments. It's got the historical, and then it's got the revival of that fourth beast, the final last days manifestation. And this beast is dreadful, terrifying, extremely strong. It had large iron teeth. It's describing its nature, its characteristics. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. It was different from all the other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So the horns represent the kingdoms, the nations that form this empire, right? Again, 10-nation coalition over and over and over again. Throughout Daniel and Revelation, the beast empire is defined as being comprised of 10, including the Antichrist, 11 kingdoms or nations. It is not global. It does not include every single last nation in the earth. There are much more than just 10 horns throughout the earth. That's, again, an important side note. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them. And then 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, the horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts. So here, this is talking about the Antichrist, the little horn. He emerges, he arises from one of these 10 kingdoms, and when he does, he overthrows 3 other kingdoms, okay? And he's defined as someone who has a mouth and great boasts, okay? He is speaking. He's got a big mouth, okay? Very simple. Verse 9, I kept looking until thrones were set up. This is the heavenly courtroom in Daniel 7. He's looking, he sees the heavenly courts, and the Ancient of Days took his seat on the throne, right? Thousands upon thousands were attending him, myriads of holy ones. The court sat, the books were opened. Then I kept looking because of the sound, now again, back to the horn, of the boastful words which the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain. Its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. Now notice that it's talking about the beast, which is the coalition, but then it zeroes in on the horn, and the horn is the arrogant one. And then it's as though Daniel starts speaking of the horn, and it calls him the beast. It's not like it's shifting back and forth from the empire to the individual. There's a degree to where the individual and his kingdom, king, kingdom, emperor, emperor, there's just sort of a telescoping element here where they are one and the same. But here Daniel kind of zeroes in on the individual. And he says, his body will be slain and thrown into the blazing fire. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because some people will point to the fact that in the book of Revelation it says the Antichrist is thrown alive into the lake of fire. So the idea is, well, he's not killed. I go, no, there are other verses clearly in the Bible that says the Antichrist, the individual, will be killed. Here's one of them in Daniel 7. Elsewhere it says that when Jesus returns, he will slay the lawless one with the breath of his mouth and the glory of his coming. Isaiah 14 specifically says the Antichrist will be buried in a mass pit, in a mass grave. Okay, so it's important. There's no contradiction between him being cast alive into the lake of fire or the idea of him being killed and buried. Those things are not contradictory. There's no problem there. Okay, now we move forward to Daniel chapter 8. Okay, so Daniel 7 portrays the Antichrist as an individual that emerges from what? Pagan, Gentile nations. He uproots 3 other pagan Gentile nations. Again, it's so important. The biblical narrative does not portray an individual at the end of the age that is a false Jewish Messiah. He is not a false Jewish nationalist that rises up from within Israel or outside of Israel and causes Israel to have some greater Israel, some false greater Israel narrative. Again, that's the idea that has been set forth by Chris White, who's articulated these things in a few of his books, but he is not the only one. That's the thing I want to make very clear. And I don't know a lot of the different names out there. I don't really, to be honest, pay much attention to a lot. I know a lot of people watch a lot of YouTube videos, this type of thing. I don't. I try not to, but people send me stuff. They go, what do you think about this? And I go, guys, I don't have time to answer every single thing. What do I think about this or that? But I have taken the time to work through some of Chris White's stuff, and that is the scenario that he sets forth, that he's this Jewish leader that rises up, this false Christ. And again, that idea was set forth by some of the early church fathers, some of the early church writers, but it is completely not the narrative set forth by the Scriptures. So now we move forward from Daniel chapter 7 to Daniel 8, verses 9 through 12. It's a completely different picture. We now have a ram, two-horned ram, and a goat with one horn, different beasts, okay? But it's zeroing in on sort of a different period within the larger storyline that Daniel 7 was telling. But then it uses very similar language. Here in Daniel 8, it uses very similar language to what we just saw in chapter 7. And it says, out of one of them came forth a rather small horn. So now it's different beasts, again, that have a different number of horns. And we're dealing with the goat. It had a prominent horn. The prominent horn gets broken off. 4 horns grow up in its place. And then out of one of these horns, and what are these horns? These are, again, kingdoms or nations. Out of one of them, out of one of these dynasties, a lot of people would say these are significant dynasties. Out of one of them comes a rather small horn. The exact same language that was just used of the Antichrist in Daniel chapter 7. And it says, the small horn grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. Again, this is the Antichrist. Exceedingly great. And I'll show you why it's the Antichrist as we move forward. Paul clearly interpreted this little horn here as the Antichrist. Absolutely. It grew up to the host of heaven, and it caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. Now, in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, it refers back to this event, and it places it in the future. It places this event when Satan is cast down to the earth, and he's enraged because he knows his time is short. It casts this as a future event that will happen in the midpoint of the final 7 years before the return of Jesus. And that's when all hell breaks loose, so to speak. But notice this individual, he's more than just a man. It's using, by the way, and all commentaries will acknowledge, it's using the historical character of Antiochus Epiphanes as its basis, as it's pointing to the ultimate last days Antiochus, the Antichrist, the ultimate last days enemy of Israel. Okay, but it's using the historical figure of Antiochus for Epiphanes. And again, it's more here. It's more than anything that a man can do. Antiochus didn't cause the host of heaven to come down, right? No. It trampled them down. It magnified itself. Now, here's the key. Here's a very important statement. This little horn, the Antichrist, will magnify itself, exalt itself to be equal to the commander of the host. The Antichrist will exalt himself to be equal to, or yea, even greater than Jesus, greater than Yahweh himself. Okay? And it removed the regular sacrifice from him. And the place of his sanctuary, that's Yahweh's sanctuary, is thrown down. The little horn, the Antichrist, will exalt himself above even Yahweh, to be equal to or greater than Yahweh. And that is carried out through the act of sitting in God's seat. Again, the temple, from a biblical Jewish perspective, is the earthly extension of God's throne in heaven. That's how it's understood. That's how temples are understood in ancient Near Eastern culture. So the Jewish temple, Yahweh's temple, in Jerusalem is Yahweh's earthly throne. Satan sets himself up on God's throne. That is the act of saying, I'm better than this guy. That's what it is. And on top of it, he will cause the sanctuary, that's the temple, to be thrown down. That's what Daniel 8 says. And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice. It will fling truth to the ground, perform its will, and prosper. I always have to point out here, folks say, Joel, do you believe in the prosperity gospel? Do you believe in the prosperity message? I say, well, the Bible is very clear. The Antichrist will prosper in all he does. So we have to believe in some type of prosperity gospel, right? The God himself will allow his people, for a period, to be turned over to the Antichrist, to his power, and he will succeed in all he does. Scriptures are painfully clear on that point. Then moving forward, again, Daniel builds and builds, and we could elaborate a bit more on Daniel chapter 8. But in Daniel chapter 11, really 11 through 12, Daniel, again, is now focusing on sort of a different period of the larger story, but he reiterates and essentially tells the same story. And he talks about this individual in Daniel 11, verse 31, that will cause the abomination that causes desolation. It repeats this theme 4 times throughout Daniel. It talks about it in Daniel 8, talks about it in Daniel 9, talks about it here in Daniel 11:31, and then in chapter 12, verse 11, the abomination that causes desolation. He will cause offerings to cease in the Jewish temple, and he will destroy and cause the temple to be desolate. He will set himself up in the temple. That is a definitive event in the Old Testament narrative of this coming evil one. He doesn't build it up and say, hey, this is my place. He casts it down. He mocks it. He is the one who is arrogant in all that he does. He speaks unheard of things against the God of the temple. Against the God of the temple. Let's look at this. Daniel 11, 36 through 38. This is where we actually have some verses that speak of, in my opinion, the theology of the Antichrist. This is the foundational passage whereby the Bible defines the belief system of the Antichrist. It says this: the king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself. Now again, here it is, reiterating what we just read in Daniel 8, above the commander of the host. It says, he will exalt himself above every god. He will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. Now, in my debate with Dr. Tommy Ice a few years ago, it ended. We were out of time. And Dr. Ice was laughing at me, going, the Antichrist is going to blaspheme God. You know, like he's going, a Muslim Messiah, like this just doesn't work. A Muslim Antichrist figure, it just doesn't work. And I said, well, he's going to be a blasphemer. How can he claim to be God? You know, that's what he was saying, is he was saying a Muslim would never claim to be God. I said, how can he claim to be Yahweh? Which God does he claim to be? Because the Bible says that he speaks blasphemies against God. And he goes, well, Jesus spoke blasphemies. And I go, I didn't have the time to explain. There's different types of blasphemies. According to the Jews, there's the blasphemy of claiming to be Yahweh. That's blasphemy. But there are also blasphemies where you say Yahweh is, you know, this, that, and the other thing, to speak negative things about him. Jesus only spoke wonderful things about Yahweh, but he claimed to be Yahweh. That was blasphemy. The Antichrist, on the other hand, his blasphemy is that he will speak out against God. Against God. So by the way, when we get to 2 Thessalonians, and we'll get there, this is a big issue. Christians always focus on Thessalonians. He's going to declare verbally, I am God. That doesn't work, guys, because the foundational biblical text for the theology of the Antichrist is right here. It's in Daniel 8, Daniel 11. He exalts himself above all gods. He speaks monstrous things against Yahweh, right? He destroys, he desecrates, he vandalizes Yahweh's throne. And then it goes on. He will show no regard for Elohim Ab. Now, most translations, they translate it different ways. That is the God of the fathers. What fathers? Every time that term is used throughout the scriptures, Elohim Ab, comma, Elohim, Avraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He will show no regard for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's the first statement. And then he will show no regard for the desire of women. That has been understood in a broad range of different ways, but I'm telling you guys, what Daniel is saying is he shows no regard for God the Father, God the Son. The desire of women is the Messiah. From Genesis 3:15, ever since God declared that the seed is coming forth from the woman, every Jewish woman has been yearning and waiting and expecting, hoping perhaps her child would be the Messiah. You see it in Genesis. Lamech has Noah, and he says, this one will give us relief. There's this ongoing yearning and expectation from among the righteous seed line of Eve all the way through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There was this yearning, this waiting for the seed. So he is called, it's an idiom, a Hebrew idiom. The Messiah here is called the desired one of women. And so because it's making a series of statements concerning his theology. He shows no regard for Elohim Ab. He shows no regard for the desire of women, the Father and the Son. What does it say specifically in Psalm 2? It says the kings of the earth, they're all upset. They're in an uproar. They take their stand against Yahweh and his Mashiach, against the Lord and his anointed, against the Father and the Son. It's this twofold denial of the kings of the earth. The Gentiles, the nations, are in an uproar against the Father and the Son. Here, the Antichrist, the embodiment in their leader, he shows no regard for the God of the fathers, for the Messiah, for the Father, for the Son. He shows no regard for any other God. He shows no regard for any other God. They go, well, how can he be a Muslim? Read the rest of this sentence. This is what drives me crazy is people, they'll pull one statement out of this fourfold statement. Okay, the first part of the statement shows no regard for the God of the fathers, no regard for the Messiah, no regard for any other God, but there is a God that he does worship. That is the key. There is a God. He has a God. The Antichrist will have a God. It says he will magnify and exalt himself above all the other gods, right? But instead he will honor. He does worship. He does honor a God of fortresses, a God of forces, a God of war. He has a God, and the Bible defines his God as a God of war. And then it says a God that his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures, things that traditional worshipers do. Okay, the Antichrist has a God. This is so essential. When we get to 2 Thessalonians, when we get to the writings of Paul, we need to understand that this was Paul's Bible. Paul was looking at Daniel 8. He was looking at Daniel 11. He's not just coming up with new information. Paul was expounding and expanding upon. He was expositing the Bible. In Thessalonians, that's what he's doing. Christians, we just start with the New Testament. We don't understand the Old Testament foundations. Well, then, of course, you have Ezekiel 38 and 39, again, which I discussed. I mean, this is really the quintessential Old Testament oracle about the Antichrist. Numbers 24, again, one of the first earliest references to the Antichrist, it calls him Gog. Most translations will say Agag. Again, the Septuagint uses Gog, but this is the first reference to Gog. Ezekiel doesn't just throw out this idea concerning Gog. It was understood. Gog is the Antichrist. Gog is actually the primary name for the Antichrist in the Old Testament. And all of the things that the Antichrist does, Gog does, and of course Ezekiel 38, 39, culminate with all of the nations knowing that Yahweh is Yahweh, that he is the God of Israel, in the land of Israel. All of Israel worships him, and the Lord pours out his Spirit on Israel, and the Lord will no longer allow his name to be blasphemed. Ezekiel 38, 39 ends with the return of the Messiah. It says, Kadosh, Kadosh, Bah Yisrael, the Holy One in Israel. They will know that I am the Holy One in Israel, and all the nations will tremble at my face. Okay? Ezekiel 38, 39 portrays the return of the Messiah. It is the Revelation 19, the parousia, the coming of the Lord of the Old Testament, the primary oracle throughout all of this. And it just builds upon the same thing. And what do you have? What does Ezekiel 38, 39 describe? A coalition of Middle Eastern, foreign, Gentile, non-Jewish invaders of the land of Israel. I mean, it's crystal clear, right? Okay, now here we are at 2 Thessalonians. Now we get to the writings of Paul, the Apostle John, and let's look at this. In 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 3 through 5. Let no one in any way deceive you, for it, the day of the Lord, will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness, the Antichrist, is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so much so that he actually takes his seat in the temple of God. See, this is the whole point. It is the act of sitting in God's throne because he is going to destroy God's temple. He's going to desecrate it. He doesn't sit in God's seat and say, he's not going to pull a David Koresh, I'm God. Which God? If you believe that the Antichrist will verbally say, I'm God, the answer is which God? It can't be Yahweh because he speaks monstrous things against Yahweh. He blasphemes. He mocks Yahweh. He puts Yahweh down. He tries to, right? So it can't be Yahweh. So you go, well, it's a different God. He doesn't claim to be God. He claims to be, as it says in Daniel 8, equal to or superior to the commander of the Lord of hosts. He tries to set himself above the God of the Bible, but he also has a God. You cannot claim to be Yahweh. I'm Yahweh, and by the way, my God is so-and-so. Like, that doesn't work. You can't say, I'm Yahweh, he's a complete idiot. Okay, so in order to understand this difficult issue, how does the Antichrist relate? We have to understand the full counsel of Scripture. We have to understand the foundational texts that form the biblical understanding of the Antichrist, what he will do, who he will be, who he will lead, all of these things, right? It says displaying himself as being God. He tries to prop himself up and say, hey, I'm superior to the God of the temple, and I'm sitting in God's seat, right? If I'm sitting in God's seat, where is he? You've seen the atheists and the unbelievers. They go, well, if God's real, then may he strike me down right now with a bolt of lightning. And they go, well, I guess God's not real, ha, ha, ha. I mean, that's essentially what Satan will do, but in the most overt, offensive way possible. He will actually place himself in the temple of God, exalt himself above the commander of the host, and desecrate and bring to desolation the Jewish temple. He will cause the offerings to cease. And then he will continue to honor his God of fortresses. And again, I would argue that that is ultimately a God of jihad. That's a side issue. Verses 8 through 12. Then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will slay, kill with the breath of his mouth, bring to an end by the appearance of his coming. His coming. Where does that begin? Where does that foundational biblical concept, that theme begin? Deuteronomy 33. The Lord comes from Sinai. How does it end? It ends with the Lord saving his people Israel, verses 28, from the nations. It ends, he comes, the Lord comes, and he saves his people, and he's radiant like the shining forth of the sun. That's what this is ultimately referring to. He comes by the appearance, by the brightness of his coming. That is, and now he's talking about the Antichrist, the one whose coming is in accord with the activity of Satan, with all the serpent back in the garden, Genesis 3:15, all powers, signs, and false wonders, with all deception of wickedness for those who perish, because they did not receive the love of truth so as to be saved. For this reason God has sent them a deluding influence, so that they will believe what is false, in order that they may be judged. All will be judged who do not believe the truth, but took pleasure in wickedness. Who are the primary peoples of the earth that will be deceived? Will it primarily be Christians who support Israel? Will it primarily be Jews? No, it will primarily be the nations that have refused to love the truth that will come against the Jews and the Christians. That's what it clearly says in Revelation 12, right? The dragon goes after the woman and those who keep the commandments of Jesus. The Antichrist is the leader of the coalition, the armies, the nations that come against God's people, which is, yes, Christians, Messianic Jews, but also unbelieving Jews. Because as Paul says clearly, right, just work through Romans 9 through 11, they are unbelievers. They are enemies of the gospel. Enemies of the gospel, but yet they are beloved. They are beloved enemies. And his purpose, because of his covenants, is to ultimately save his people, Israel. Because again, the gospel is first to the Jew. And unless God saves the remnant, the residue, those who remain of his people, all Israel will be saved, Paul says. If he doesn't do that, then he is not faithful to his covenants. Anyone who understands the Old Testament story of God's promises to his people understand that it has to culminate with Israel being saved. Israel being saved. The story that the Bible tells is not one of Israel being the primary enemies of God. It is the story of Israel being chastised as children, as being pursued, as the enmity between the serpent and the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman that culminates, that begins in Genesis 3:15, that culminates at the end of the age. 1 John 2, now here's the Apostle John. 1 John 2, verse 22. Who is the liar but the one who denies that Jesus is the Messiah? This is the Antichrist, the one who denies the Father and the Son. Where does John get that idea from? Again, what is the primary Old Testament text that defines the theology of the Antichrist? Where is it? If there's one place in the Bible that lays out his theology, it is in Daniel chapter 11. When John the Apostle is talking about the theology, the belief system of the Antichrist, he obviously is drawing from Daniel 11, 36 through 38, and he says he denies the Father, he denies the Son, he denies Elohim Ab, he denies the desire of women, because that's exactly what Daniel was saying. John is simply reiterating what has already been said. Whoever denies the Son does not have the Father. And yeah, guys, look, let's be clear. An Orthodox Jew today who denies Jesus as the Messiah does not have the Father. And in that sense, that is the spirit of Antichrist. Because as John says, many Antichrists have gone on. Anyone who denies the Son is Antichrist, but that is not the ultimate Antichrist, the individual. And that is, there's a big difference between being an unbeliever because this is the thing, is this growing movement of Christian anti-Semites. They love to make that point. Yeah, but the Jews are Antichrist. Haven't you read the Talmud? Haven't you read? Guys, that's not a surprise. It's not a surprise to Paul, but he still calls them beloved. He goes, guys, whatever you do, don't look down on the unbelieving Jews. Don't look down on the natural branches. If you do, you will be broken off. If you look down with arrogance and think, yeah, but I'm a believer, they're not, and if you're bashing God's people, then you wild branches, you Gentiles, you run the risk of being broken off. And guys, I'm telling you, the language and the hatred that is used by an increasing number of anti-Semitic, Jew-hating Christians online, oh, the synagogue of Satan, haven't you read the Talmud? Like, it is vile. And it's growing and it's spreading. And you could say, well, that's because of YouTube culture or whatever. It's giving opportunity to the wickedness that's in man's hearts. But guys, it begins with bad theology. It begins with bad teaching. Or which comes first, the bad heart or the bad theology? I don't know. But the point is they work together. And I want to resist both. And I want to expose both. I want to expose the system and the corrupt hearts. And again, I want to be clear, some who embrace the system don't have the bad hearts, but stick in the system long enough and see where it leads you. Whoever denies the Son does not have the Father. The one who confesses the Son has the Father. Okay? John, when he talks about the theology of the Antichrist, is drawing directly from Daniel chapter 11, verses 36 through 38. He denies the Father. He denies the Son. He denies every other God. But he does have a God of war, a God of forces. We get to Revelation 13. Revelation 13, verse 1 through 4. The dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. The dragon is the serpent. The dragon is the serpent it's the Leviathan. It is the deceiver of Genesis 3:15. There's the dragon. He stands on the seashore. And then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea. Now again, the sea here represents the Gentiles. A coalition of nations come up out of the Gentile nations. It has 10 horns, 7 heads. Again, 10 horns, same thing, reiterating what Daniel has already said. And on his horns were 10 crowns, and on his heads were blasphemous names. The beast, the fourth beast of Daniel, what does it have? It's like a leopard, with feet like those of a Medo-Persian bear, with the mouth of a Babylonian lion. It is a combination, a composite of Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. That is not the European Union, guys. Wake up and pay attention. That is not the European Union. And these are not just characteristics. It's a misfit, weird beast that has a mixed body of all three. And that's exactly what it says, by the way, in Daniel chapter 2, verse 40, and then in verses 34 through 35, it says that when the beast is destroyed, this rock cut out not by human hands, that's the coming of the Messiah, when the Messiah comes back, it strikes the statue on the feet of iron and clay. And then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold were all destroyed at the same time. Why? Because when you destroy the feet, you are by virtue destroying Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece at the same time. Because the final beast empire is a composite of Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. The dragon gave this Antichrist empire his throne and great authority. I saw one of the heads as if it had been slain. A fatal wound was healed. Again, the revival, the coming back of this kingdom. Again, that's the legs into the feet. Many believe the Antichrist himself individually will come back from the dead. That may be the case, but first and foremost, the beast is the empire. First and foremost, it's the empire, and then it kind of, again, that telescoping, it kind of shifts from the individual to the empire, but here its primary context is the empire. The whole earth was amazed, and it followed after the beast. They worshipped Satan. As a result of following after this particular Antichrist and his coalition, the people will, by virtue, be worshiping Satan. And guys, I'm sorry, but with any false religion today, when someone worships a false god, they are, through that false god, worshiping Satan. Doesn't mean that they are Satanists. They're not following Anton LaVey and, with goats and all this type of thing. They often believe. In times past, it was Baal versus Yahweh, right? It was Marduk. It was all of these various gods against Yahweh. But in the last days, Satan himself has dressed up and presented himself as if he is Yahweh. He's pretended to be the God of the Bible. And so individuals today, as they worship their gods, they think it's the God of heaven and earth, but they're actually, if they're not worshiping, again, through the Son, if they're not worshiping the one true God of the Bible, then ultimately they're worshiping Satan. They worship the beast. They said, who is like the beast? Who can wage war with him? Well, this is an army, a coalition so great. Who can fight against this thing? This is not just Turkey. It's Turkey, it's Iran, it's Sudan, it's Libya, it's all the armies of the Middle East combined. Who can fight against this? Verses 6 through 10. There was given to him a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies. Again, here's Revelation pointing back to the language of Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, and authority to act for how long? 42 months, 3.5 years. The Antichrist will act for that final 3.5 years. He opened his mouth in blasphemies against God, okay? To blaspheme his name and his tabernacle. Again, to mock, to put down God's temple. That is, those who dwell in heaven. And it was given him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. The Antichrist will fight against Christians. He will not primarily recruit Christians. Jesus said the Antichrist will come with all kinds of deception so as to deceive the elect, if that were possible. This whole scenario that the Antichrist is going to be this Jewish nationalist Zionist leader that will primarily deceive Christians is not the biblical narrative. The Bible tells the story of an Antichrist who will fight against Christians, against Jews, who will invade the land of Israel, right? It's Israel is his enemies. The Jewish people are his enemies. Christians are his enemies. Authority over every tongue, tribe, people, and nation was given to him. He will have his tentacles, his reach will extend throughout all of the earth because his followers, his worshipers, his co-religionists will be throughout the earth, right? All who dwell on the earth will worship him, everyone whose name is not written in the book from the foundation of the Lamb who was slain. If anyone has an ear to hear, let him hear. Verses 11 through 14. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb. Now this is the false prophet. This is where people go, well, maybe the false prophet could be Jewish. That's possible. I want to acknowledge that's possible. Others say he could be a Christian. However, there's actually, because you go, if the sea represents the Gentiles, then the earth must represent Israel. That's not necessarily true. That's not necessarily true. In fact, I would suspect that the false prophet will also be a radical Muslim. I actually suspect that they're both going to be radical nationalist Muslims. Is it possible that one could be Jewish? Yes, it's possible. I want to acknowledge that. However, the term their land in the Bible, throughout the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and the Greek New Testament, land is sometimes used for the land of Israel. Sometimes it's used for all of the Middle East, throughout all the land. Other times it's actually used for the whole earth. And there's multiple words in the Greek. You've got gay, you've got oikomenos, you've got cosmos. You've got multiple different words for, and it's similar to English. The earth, well, you can have a little handful of earth. Or it could be the whole planet. That's quite a difference. It's very similar in both Hebrew and Greek. And so I just want to say it's not by any means a foregone conclusion that the false prophet would be Jewish. It is possible. I want to acknowledge that. But the Antichrist himself most certainly is not Jewish. And I personally really highly doubt that the false prophet would be as well. There's no solid biblical basis for either one being Jewish, other than just that term land. And that's my point is it's a really weak argument. There's actually a lot more there that I could unpack over that specific issue, the false prophet, that you can't understand unless you understand some stuff that's in the intertestamental literature, that's in the pseudepigraphical and the deuterocanonical literature. And it has to do with Behemoth and Leviathan, and it's really kind of an interesting topic. Maybe we'll talk about it sometime, but we don't have time to unpack it right now. So I'm going to end it right there. Eventually you get to Revelation 19. Jesus bursts forth from heaven. He kills the beast and the false prophet and all of their armies. Where are they? They've gathered in Israel. They've gathered in Jerusalem. I will bring them all down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Guys, the story from the beginning to the very end is consistent. It begins with this narrative of enmity, of conflict between the people of God, the people that will bring forth Messiah, and the children of Satan. It's not to say that, look, Jesus is very clear. There are plenty of Jews that are objects of destruction. It's not like you're just saved because you're Jewish. And there are plenty of Gentiles because of the gospel, right? This thing's wide open, that have been brought in by faith. They're children of Abraham. However, so this is not just like some shallow ethnic salvation by ethnicity kind of thing. I'm just saying the story, the narrative is there is a particular righteous seed line, and that is primarily defined by Israel. And that remains right up until the end. And the story of the coming of the Messiah he is the one that will reestablish the throne of his father David, as his apostles were expecting after listening to him teach for 40 days in his glorified resurrected body. When are you going to reestablish? When are you going to restore the kingdom of Israel? That is a right biblical expectation. The kingdom of Israel will be restored when Jesus returns from heaven in blazing glory. The idea, the very suggestion that Christians would accept an Antichrist because he's a nationalist Messiah, if he doesn't burst forth from heaven in blazing glory as the Son of God to rescue us from the oppression of the Antichrist, there's no way in the world we would even begin to consider it. No way in the world that any discerning Christian would even begin to consider it. So amen and amen. It was essential that we went through all of the relevant texts. We need to have a solid theology, a biblical theology of the Antichrist. We need to understand the story, to understand the narrative. And that way that's going to deliver us and save us from a lot of these false ideas that are popular, increasing, being cast around, that are wrong. They're unbiblical. And they're also destructive. So amen. Look forward to seeing you all next time. Until then, I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground.